I was in my childhood home when I heard it, a voice I hadn't heard in 45 years, crackling through an old ham radio in the attic at 2 a.m. My uncle's voice, clear as spring water, calling my name. He'd been buried before I turned 10. I stood frozen in the narrow hallway outside what used to be his room. The floorboards cold beneath my bare feet, the house silent except for the static hum and that voice. Low, urgent, repeating a string of numbers I didn't understand. My hand shook as I pushed open the attic door. The radio sat on his old workbench, glowing faintly, dust swirling in the dim light from the single bulb overhead. I hadn't been up here in years. Not since my father died. Not since I inherited the house and all its ghosts. The voice stopped. The radio went silent. I stood there breathing hard, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My Uncle David had died in a car accident in 1979. I was 9. I remembered the funeral, small, quiet, my mother crying in the front pew. I remembered my father's face, hard and unreadable. I remembered the casket being lowered into the ground. I didn't remember anyone mentioning a ham radio. I went back downstairs, made coffee, told myself I was overtired. I'd been sorting through decades of family paperwork, preparing to sell the house. Stress did strange things to the mind. I convinced myself it was a dream, a half-asleep hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too many memories stirred up at once. But the next night it happened again. Same time, same voice. Same string of numbers, followed by a single word, Catalina. This time I was wide awake. I grabbed my phone, opened the voice recorder, and climbed the attic stairs. The radio was on again, though I'd unplugged it the night before. The voice came through in bursts, distorted by static but unmistakable. I recorded 30 seconds before it cut out entirely. In the morning I played it back. It was real. It was his voice. I didn't know how, but I knew it was him. I grew up in this house, the youngest of 3 in a family that didn't talk about feelings or the past. My father worked at the post office for 40 years. My mother kept house and garden. My Uncle David was the outlier, charming, restless, always tinkering with electronics, always talking about boats in distant places. He lived with us on and off, sleeping in the attic room, filling the house with the smell of solder and engine oil. Then one night he didn't come home. 2 days later, the police found his car wrapped around a tree 30 miles outside town. Closed casket. My father handled everything. My mother stopped mentioning his name. I was too young to ask the right questions. Now I was 54, a retired high school teacher, alone in a house full of things no one wanted. My siblings had taken what they cared about years ago and moved to other states. The house was mine to sell, the belongings mine to sort. I'd been doing it slowly, room by room, box by box. I hadn't touched the attic until last week. That morning after the second broadcast, I started searching. I pulled out boxes of old tax records, school papers, photographs. I found my uncle's logbook tucked inside a milk crate beneath the workbench, a spiral-bound notebook filled with dates, frequencies, call signs, and notes written in his small, precise handwriting. The last entry was dated September 14, 1979, 2 days before he died. The entry read, "Final transfer complete. Catalina secure. If anything happens, coordinates and safety deposit 447. I sat back on my heels, staring at the page. Transfer. Catalina safety deposit box. I'd never heard any of this. I went to the bank that afternoon. The same bank my family had used for generations. A small town branch with wood paneling and older tellers who remembered everyone's name. I asked about box 447. The woman behind the counter, gray-haired and polite, checked the records. "That box is listed under David Monroe," she said, "but it's flagged. There's a secondary holder, your father, Harold Monroe. Since both are deceased, you'd need to provide proof of inheritance and go through probate verification." "How long will that take?" "A few weeks, maybe more." I filled out the paperwork. She made copies of my ID, my father's death certificate, the property deed. She was kind but thorough. I left feeling like I'd opened a door I didn't understand yet. That night, I went back to the attic and examined the radio. It was a Heathkit HBD 100, a model from the late 70s. I didn't know much about ham radios, but I knew they required power and an antenna. I traced the cord. It ran along the wall, disappeared into a gap behind the insulation, and connected to a small solar panel mounted on the roof. Backup power. Someone had set this up to run independently. I checked the frequency dial. It was locked on a single channel, a maritime band used by boats Catalina. A boat, it had to be. I started searching online, looking for boat registrations, old records, anything tied to my uncle's name. I found nothing. I called my older sister Janet in Arizona. She barely remembered him. He was always weird, she said. Dad didn't like him much. I think they fought about money once, but I was a teenager. I didn't pay attention. Did he have a boat? I don't know. Maybe. Why? I didn't tell her about the voice. I didn't want to sound insane. Instead, I went to the county clerk's office. I explained I was researching family history. The clerk, a woman in her 30s with red glasses and a patient demeanor, pulled up property records, vehicle registrations, and court filings. There's a lion filing here from 1978, she said, scrolling through the screen. Harold Monroe filed against David Monroe. It was resolved in 1979, just before David's death. Looks like a dispute over co-owned property. What kind of property? She clicked through. It's listed as a marine vessel, 32-foot sailboat. Registered name Catalina Blue. My chest tightened. What happened to it? Ownership transferred entirely to Harold Monroe in September 1979. Then it was sold 6 months later. Private sale, no buyer name listed. I walked out of that office with a printout and a cold, creeping certainty that my father had lied. That night I didn't wait for the radio. I went up to the attic, sat at the workbench, and started going through every box, every drawer, every loose paper. I found old navigation charts, receipts from a marina 2 hours south, and a photograph. My uncle standing on the deck of a sailboat, tanned and grinning, the name Catalina Blue painted across the stern. On the back, in his handwriting, "She's finally mine, 1977. But according to the county records, the boat had been co-owned. My father's name was on it too. I found a letter, folded into quarters, tucked inside the logbook. It was addressed to my mother, but never sent. The handwriting was my uncle's. It was short. "Marie, if you're reading this, something went wrong. Harold knows. He thinks I'm stealing from him, but I'm not. I'm protecting what's mine. The boat is paid for with my money, my work. He co-signed because I needed credit, but he's trying to take it. He's threatened me twice now. I've moved everything offshore. Coordinates in the box. If I disappear, don't trust his version. I'm not running. I'm fixing this. David." I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking. I tried to remember my father. Really remember him. He'd been a rigid man, silent, controlled. He didn't drink, didn't raise his voice. But he had a way of making a room feel smaller when he was angry. I'd spent my childhood trying not to upset him. My mother had done the same. And my uncle. He'd been the one who laughed, who taught me to use tools, who talked about the ocean like it was a second home. Then he was gone. And no one ever explained why the funeral felt so rushed, so cold. I looked at the letter again. He's threatened me twice. Had my father killed him? No. That was too far. The police report said accident, single vehicle collision. No other cars involved. My father had been at home that night. I'd been there, I remembered. But the boat, the lie, the transfer of ownership 2 days before David died. I needed the safety deposit box. I called the bank the next morning. The teller from before, Mrs. Brennan, answered. I asked if there was any way to expedite the process. She hesitated. "There might be," she said quietly. "If you can provide a death certificate for David Monroe and proof that you're the sole surviving heir to Harold Monroe's estate, we could potentially release the contents under an emergency estate provision. But you'd need a notarized affidavit. I can get that. Then come in tomorrow. I'll have the paperwork ready." I spent that evening at a notary's office, signing documents, answering questions. By the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. I was exhausted, but I went up to the attic anyway. The radio was on again. This time the voice was different, strained, distorted. It wasn't calling my name. It was reciting coordinates. Latitude and longitude repeated twice, then silence. I wrote them down. I looked them up. They pointed to a location 50 miles offshore. Deep water near a marine sanctuary. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I went to the bank. Mrs. Brennan met me in a back room, along with a branch manager, a man in his 60s with steel, gray hair and a somber expression. He reviewed my documents carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, then nodded. The everything appears in order, he said. We'll retrieve the box. They left me alone in a small, windowless room. 5 minutes later, Mrs. Brennan returned with a metal box, narrow and dented with age. She set it on the table, gave me a quiet smile, and closed the door behind her. I opened it. Inside, a waterproof pouch, a set of keys, a folded chart, and a cassette tape. I unfolded the chart first. It was a navigation map hand-marked with routes, notes, and a circled location matching the coordinates I'd written down. Next to the circle, Catalina, deep anchor. The keys were labeled, one for a storage unit, one for a dock box, both in a coastal town I'd never visited. The cassette had a label for Marie or the kids. Play if I'm gone. I didn't have a cassette player. I had to buy one from a thrift store on the way home. I sat in my kitchen that night, the small recorder on the table in front of me, and pressed play. My uncle's voice filled the room. If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead, and if I'm dead, it wasn't an accident. He paused. I could hear the ocean in the background, the creak of a boat. Harold and I bought the Catalina together in '76. I put in 80% of the money. He put in his name because I couldn't get the loan. We agreed I'd buy him out in 2 years. I did. I paid him in full, cash, in '78, but he wouldn't sign over his half. He said I owed him more. He said I owed him for letting me live in his house, for putting up with me. He threatened to report the boat stolen if I didn't give him another 10,000. Another pause, a deep breath. I didn't have it, so I moved the boat. I moved everything I owned onto her and sailed her out past the shelf. I anchored her deep, past where he could find her. I've been living on her for 3 months, coming back to shore for supplies. I told him I sold her. He didn't believe me. He's been following me. 2 days ago, he told me if I didn't bring her back, he'd make sure I never sailed again. The tape hissed. I'm not giving him what's mine. I'm not. If something happens to me, the coordinates are in the box. The boat's there. Everything I own is there. Don't let him keep it. Don't let him win. The recording ended. I sat in the silence, my heart pounding. My father had threatened him. Maybe worse. And 2 days after that tape was made, my uncle was dead. I called the police the next morning. I explained everything, calmly, carefully. I gave them the letter, the tape, the coordinates. They listened. They took notes. A detective, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, told me she'd look into it. It's been 45 years, she said gently. The case was closed as an accident. We'd need significant new evidence to reopen it. Hay's still out there, I said. The boat. It's still out there. She gave me a look I couldn't read. We'll check the coordinates. But even if we find something, it doesn't prove your father was involved. Then what does? I don't know yet. They sent a Marine unit out 2 weeks later. I wasn't allowed to go. They called me 4 days after that. They'd found the Catalina. She was deep, resting on a shelf in a protected zone, mostly intact. Inside they found personal belongings, a locked cabinet with documents, and a logbook that matched the one in the attic. They also found something else. A second cassette tape, sealed in a waterproof case. Labeled evidence. They played it for me in the detective's office. It was a recording of an argument. My uncle's voice and my father's voice, shouting. My father was threatening him, demanding money, accusing him of stealing. My uncle was refusing, calm at first, then desperate. The recording ended with my father saying, "If you take that boat out again, you won't come back." The detective looked at me. This still isn't proof of murder, but it's enough to review the accident report. They did. They found inconsistencies. Damage to the car that didn't match a single vehicle collision. Witness reports that were never followed up. A toxicology report that showed trace sedatives in my uncle's system, dismissed at the time as over, the counter-medication. It took 6 months, but they reclassified the case. Suspicious death. They couldn't charge anyone. My father was long dead, but they amended the record. They acknowledged the possibility of foul play. It didn't bring my uncle back, but it cleared his name. I sold the house that winter. I used part of the money to pay for a memorial, a small marker near the shore where the Catalina had rested. I invited my siblings. Neither came. I stood alone by the water and said the things I wished I'd known to say when I was 9. I kept the radio. I don't know why. I brought it to my new apartment. Set it up in a corner, plugged it in. It hasn't turned on since. But sometimes, late at night, I'll sit near it and listen to the silence. And I'll remember the sound of his voice, cutting through 45 years of lies, calling me back to the truth. If you've ever stayed silent to understand what was taken from someone you loved, you're not alone.